with this huge pandemic that was putting the concepts of security and awareness elsewhere, so off the terrorist threat basically, and onto dealing with this pandemic and how Western countries were overrun with the issue. And then it had some thoughts on how to basically exploit this issue. It talked about economies in the West basically crashing because of this, and also how, because the West's focus is so much on the pandemic, that is a great opportunity to use for potential acts of terrorism. Now, I am not an intel analyst, so I cannot say I don't think we have seen actually any valid threats from ISIS while our walls are put down, so to speak, but that is a narrative that they are pushing at the moment. I do think, though, that from both the ISIS side, the ISIS Central, and then the supporter side, there are a lot of narratives that are floating around right now, and I think that's also for the broadest jihadist movement. So ISIS, as I've just mentioned, had these two propaganda pieces that were distributed, which almost gave two very distinct mixed messages. So we had the one that was dealing with how to deal with the pandemic, which was more like a global health announcement. And then we have this Al-Naba issue, which very much talks about exploiting the issue for potential attacks and down with the West and so forth. So on the supporter side, which I found very interesting, looking at supporter reaction and supporter content that we're seeing on many different online platforms that they're on now, especially after the Europol takedown in November of 2019. ISIS and its supporters are spread throughout a number of messaging platforms and social media platforms. But there are a number of narratives that do fall into common narrative themes that we've seen with ISIS propaganda in general. Charlie Winter has done some great research on this, so I highly recommend looking at some of his reports on this. But we're definitely seeing narratives that fall into the idea of victimhood of Muslims, victimhood of the Ummah, so the greater Muslim community. Revenge is another one that we're seeing, and also sustainability of the group. So ISIS and its supporters do know that they've lost a lot of territory, and they are using narratives surrounding many things, but especially COVID-19 right now, of we will survive this and we are soldiers of Allah and so forth. So some of the interesting narratives, which from a global health perspective are very worrying, is the concept that the COVID-19 is a soldier of Allah. We've seen imagery that has been created with this text across graphics that states this. And it's this idea that the virus has been sent by God to aid the jihadist cause. Once again, I said that's very worrying in the sense of if we're talking about a virus and how this virus spreads very rapidly, we really don't need to be hearing things like that. Another common thing that is happening with the narratives, with the supporters, is this idea of victimhood against the Ummah. So there have been a lot of posts on different countries or different issues that have had greater issues with the Muslim community. So we're seeing a lot, especially with China, and of course China has had a huge impact when it comes to COVID-19. But they have changed the narratives that the COVID-19 virus is a redemption for the Muslim Ummah and a plague on China for the treatment of the Uyghurs, which falls into that narrative of the greater Ummah being victimized, and then using the narratives of the virus to form a narrative that supports this idea of the Ummah, greater victimhood, and causes of dealing with this. Another thing that we're seeing as well is narratives that are very much polarizing the us versus them, and this goes into other narratives of the idea that the virus is going to protect the Muslims and the supporters of the Islamic State, while getting rid of the kuffar, the unbelievers. That's a very big common theme that we see in a lot of jihadist propaganda in general, but it's really being played up with the COVID-19 crisis. Some of the interesting imagery we're seeing, like very recently when we found out that Boris Johnson has tested positive for the COVID-19 virus, a number of supporters posted images of President Trump shaking hands with Boris Johnson, and the title was COVID-19, with this idea that they've had contact, so it will spread to leaders of the Western world. As far as other exploitations, we really are getting this idea that COVID-19 is a divine element that will support the jihadist cause. And that has been being used in imagery as well as text, as I mentioned earlier. And we also are seeing them using images of brutality that might not necessarily be attached with the COVID-19 crisis, but images from some of their provinces in different areas of the world where there might have been executions, but they will post the image of the execution and then correlate the image with not the execution that might have happened in, say, West Africa or so forth, but that these bodies that have been executed in this propaganda image are the bodies of Western individuals in the US and other Western nations. So once again, it's very much taking the COVID-19 and exploiting it for their own ideas and causes, for promoting jihad, promoting the group, promoting an us versus them narrative. I don't want to take up too much time because we know we have other panelists, but as far as implications, I will say that we have reports that a lot of anti-ISIS operations on the ground in Syria and Iraq, like US military, NATO, and so forth, have been suspended because of the virus and the highly contagious nature of it. So in a sense, that is probably going to be a little bit problematic because we have seen ISIS exploit times where, whether it's nations or towns that are in very dire positions, they exploit that for their own benefit, for their own growth. So we may see that, hopefully we won't, but that could be a possibility. And then on the larger scale of the concept that this is a global pandemic and it spread very, very easily and very quickly, some of the narrative that we're seeing of this idea that the virus doesn't affect believers of ISIS's form of Islam, which if we can even call it that, and that if you are going to support jihad, you will be immune to this virus. Those are very worrying narratives when you think that if anyone actually believes this and it is highly spreadable, that it will just make the issue that much worse because they are not going to be potentially social isolating like we are. And then if you also think about the broader issue of the remnants of what we have left on the ground of ISIS, so a lot of individuals in prisons that were ISIS members, as well as the camps that we see, the camps already have really dire conditions for health in general, and people are in very small, crowded areas. So if you think about that for the wider idea of a global pandemic, it's really not a great situation. I will end with that, and I will pass it on to Ayman.
Thanks, Chelsea. Some very interesting points there, and I think we're seeing essentially them using this crisis to back up sort of existing narratives as well and sort of prove perhaps previous claims they've made. I'm sure that also generate a lot of questions, and I should note as well that for all of you watching, if you want to ask questions to the panelists, we are going to have a Q&A session afterwards. The event goes until 12 Eastern. You'll see at the bottom of your panel a Q&A option. In there, put your questions in, and we will sift through those and put them to the speakers after they're all finished. Thanks. Go ahead, Ayman.
Hello there. It's good to be speaking, and I hope you're all keeping well. So I'm going to explore more what the Islamic State's official output has been on this topic, but I also think it's important to situate it in the context of broader jihadist discussions and literature on this matter. In my view, actually, there's been, of course, some popular coverage of this topic in the wider media. But I think the real flaw is that it's been misplaced. It's been so very selective in its look at this topic, and also reading things into Islamic State discourse in particular that are not actually there. So by that I mean that you had this infographic that Chelsea mentioned. It was in issue 225 of the Islamic State's An-Naba newsletter, which is issued by its media department, which had what it called Shari'i directives on epidemics. And the media focus was to take that and to take in particular the directive it gave about the healthy not entering the land of the epidemic and the afflicted not leaving it, to say, well, therefore IS was telling its operatives not to go to Europe. But that was a misreading of the infographic, because firstly it didn't mention Europe, but secondly, from the Islamic State's perspective, if a supporter is inside of Europe and conducts an attack and says, I'm a soldier of the caliphate and pledges allegiance, then from the organization's perspective, that is an operative of the Islamic State. So they definitely weren't saying, you know, stop attacks in Europe or the West because of this coronavirus pandemic. It's true, certainly they put out that infographic and then there was a subsequent article in their newsletter, but there's actually been a whole bunch of items that they put out on the pandemic, going actually all the way back to when it was really taking off in the media in late January 2020. I would say that if there's one particular consistent theme that runs through the discourse, it is the idea that the pandemic ultimately is God's will, and whoever gets infected by it, that's because of the will of God. And so there are a variety of ideas that then spring from that central premise. And I would again emphasize that the idea of the pandemic being God's will is something that you see this, I mean, throughout the jihadist spectrum of literature, not just within the Islamic State. So you've seen it from pro-Al-Qaeda types, you've even seen it from Hayat Tahrir Sham in Syria, for example, which declared its breaking of ties with Al-Qaeda back in all the way back in 2017. Then just to run through some of the themes more specifically, so An-Naba issue 219 was where you saw some of the first mentions of this coronavirus pandemic in the Islamic State's discourse, and they featured it. It wasn't though a central item; it was featured within the world news section that comes at the end of the newsletter, and it was reporting in quite a gleeful way about how Chinese government wasn't able to contain, or was saying that it apparently couldn't contain the pandemic, and it spoke in quite a gleeful tone about this, and referred to the Chinese government as the Chinese Taghut, or the idolatrous tyrant. But then actually in the subsequent issue, so this is now going to issue 220, they had a very detailed article about it, which wasn't widely picked up in the media at the time. It was talking about pandemics, and perhaps quite interestingly, it said that, you know, many Muslims would rush to the judgment that this pandemic is a punishment of God against the infidel. And I think, as Chelsea alluded to, there will certainly be many supporters, say, of the organization who perhaps thought that at the time. But what actually the Islamic State's, what the newsletter line took was that you shouldn't actually rush to that conclusion unless you have to be certain of the evidence and as it actually transpires. And the point they made was that actually pandemics in the past have hit the faithful and the Muslims, and it gave the example of a plague that hit the Damascus area not long after the Muslim conquest of Syria. And, you know, many Muslims were killed by these afflictions, so you shouldn't rush the idea that it's necessarily a punishment from God against specifically the infidels. I mean, the pandemic is God's will, but you can't necessarily ascertain the intention behind the intention of God's will in this regard. But what the article stresses, the important thing is to understand that it's caused by God, and that the important thing you have to do at this time is to repent to God, to fear Him, understand that this is His will. But at the same time, you should take measures, what you call worldly or material measures, that to avoid catching the disease or transmitting it to other people. So in this article, they actually outline some of these directives, which they later put in that infographic 5 issues later. So, for example, the idea you don't enter the land of the epidemic and you don't leave from it if you're already inside it. To prevent you should work to prevent transmission. And also, in perhaps what would be a blow, say, some of the anti-vaccination movement, for example, they talked about the idea of the necessity of seeking medical treatment if you've got the disease, the necessity of those who are working in medicine to try to find a vaccine. And so, I think this is an example of how this was already being covered in the magazine, but because the infographic looked a bit more glossy, and some people wanted to read into it what was not there, that got all the attention, when in reality this was already being covered a while ago by the Islamic State. The subsequent issues of An-Naba after that 220 article, again, it was talking with more glee about the spread of the virus in China. They also used the spread of the pandemic to attack, to reinforce some of their more familiar doctrinal points. For example, as is well known, the Islamic State is against the idea of visiting shrines and performing acts of worship at them. So in issue 223, they had an extended diatribe against, for example, the Shia who go to shrines in Iraq and Iran. And of course, I think they were clearly picking up on the fact that the coronavirus pandemic was spreading in Iran at that time. So they used it to attack the idea of visiting shrines and working to disinfect them, and for supposedly not understanding that the pandemic is God's tribulation against men. Then, though, following the infographic, which was already covered in some depth here, you've had 2 subsequent articles that have talked about the pandemic from different angles. The first of this is, as you know, the pandemic has, the news about it is primarily that Europe's become the epicenter, the West is the epicenter of this epidemic. They seem to have moved a bit more towards the conclusion that this is primarily an affliction that God has sent against infidels and crusaders. And looking at the various measures that Western nations were taking, for example, quarantine measures, the risks of economic collapse, withdrawing troops from various deployments overseas. The Islamic State's editorial line was that this is actually an opportunity for the Mujahideen to exploit, to try to weaken Western nations as far as they can. And the line they took in terms of justifying this was to say that Muslims, reinforcing the dichotomy of Muslims against non-Muslims, saying that Muslims should not pity the Crusaders and the Westerners, even as they go through their harshest afflictions, because the Westerners supposedly showed no sympathy for Muslims when they were being besieged in Baghuz and in Sirt and in Mosul and so on. And so, not showing any mercy, they should just exploit whatever opportunity they have to attack the West. But also they talked about things like, for example, working to free prisoners from some of these camps, as Chelsea mentioned, that prison camps in, say, Syria have very bad hygienic conditions. And one of the issues that the Nabal editorial took in issue 226 was that, hey, there are all these prison camps with these ripe conditions for spreading the epidemic. So the Muslims and Mujahideen should work to free people being held in prisons. And I think actually you've seen something of that perhaps play out recently on the ground, because there were just reports of an attempted prison break in northeast Syria by detainees. And it's clear that the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces don't have the situation fully under control. So I think definitely that's something that's now discourse playing out in reality with this attempted prison break. But just in general, yeah, the Muslims shouldn't pity the infidels, and they should understand that they're enemies, and that just as the infidels have no mercy on them, the Muslims should have no mercy on them in this crisis. And then finally, what they've most recently affirmed was this editorial they put out last week, which specifically criticized conspiracy theories that America is behind everything in the world, whether it's overthrowing governments or natural disasters. And so in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, they criticize those who are positing that it's an American creation designed to hurt China, or that it's an American creation designed to hurt their rivals in the West, and so America can emerge stronger. But actually, they reinforce the idea that the coronavirus pandemic is God's will, and whoever gets struck by it, it is a matter of the will of God. I don't know how many minutes I've spoken on for now, but that's a broad overview of what the Islamic State. That's an overview of what the Islamic State's official media discourse has been saying. As I mentioned, there's much overlap with wider jihadist discourse about these topics. For example, the emphasis on God's will as opposed to the idea of material earthly causes. But then at the same time, which might not seem entirely consistent, is the advice to take the measures you need to take to try to avoid transmission of the illness, whether it's through good hand hygiene or not. If you're in the land of the epidemic, you should stay in it lest you leave it and transmit it elsewhere. And the idea that the Muslim who dies in this pandemic is a martyr in God's eyes. I'm actually just going to stop it there now, rather than just repeat myself and keep blabbering on. Leave it to Oren to talk more. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Some useful things to take out from there. I think perhaps a bit of a warning for the media to sort of be careful on how they're reporting some of this, or how much they want to extrapolate from the little information we have so far. In a way, of course, we're seeing somewhat predictable reactions from a religious extremist group, the sort of punishment for the unbelievers or test for the believers approach, whichever one works for them sort of at the time. And also interesting that you mentioned about their view of the conspiracy theories. Often you do see groups saying that the conspiracy theory itself is a conspiracy to take attention away from the reality. So a couple interesting things there. Again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box there at the bottom. You can pull it up there from the bottom. Oren, now is good. We're going to pivot now to look at how the extreme right are dealing with this and other hate groups. He's also going to share with us a slideshow. Go ahead, Oren. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I figured it'd be better to look at something on the screen than just my face. And thank you, GW, and the program on extremism for holding this. Maybe not the most uplifting conversation in a time of a global pandemic, but certainly a necessary one. So the Center on Extremism and ADL, our team looks at, investigates extremists from across the ideological spectrum, going where the hate is, especially on the online platforms, to see what are the sentiment, what are the campaigns, tactics, and activities of extremists throughout the year. And we've been doing the same, obviously, during this pandemic, to see how extremists will try to leverage this moment in time. We've been actually tracking the hateful messages, the conspiracy theories surrounding the coronavirus since late December, early January. It's these conspiracy theories and this hate that really is the foundation of much of the extremist ideologies that we see. And so, we've put together various publications on what we've seen thus far. And the spread of this hate and misinformation, it's not just that it is feeding off of fear and anxiety and the uncertainty that I think many of us around the country and around the world feel, but it actually makes it more difficult in certain circumstances to access accurate information. So it has a double sort of effort in terms of putting out more of these conspiracy theories and disinformation out to confuse people, but also to leverage an extremist agenda during a time of uncertainty. So in this presentation, I'll be brief. This is just meant to be a sampling of some of what we're seeing. I'll look at how the coronavirus is being used to promote specific types of hate and extremism and conspiracy theories. We'll look at how these are spreading a bit. And then most importantly, what is the impact of this hate and extremism in the real world, on the ground? How do we measure that, and what are we seeing? And so I want to just start off with some very basic conspiracy theories. You know, we will notice that some of these are very much, just a repackaging of old conspiracy theories, but for a modern age. And so anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in particular, about how Jewish people are trying to use this virus to manipulate global events to their benefit at the expense of non-Jews. I mean, this is like one of the classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It actually traces back even to the bubonic plague, an idea that, again, Jews purposely inflicted disease on non-Jews. And much of what we're seeing, too, is actually focused not just on this sort of the concept, as you see on the left, of a Jewish caricature. What you see on in the left of a very sort of stereotypical Jewish person is one of the most popular memes online. It's called the Happy Merchant, of a sort of a Jewish caricature about this Trojan horse, and Jews are using this conspiracy to try to, again, seek global control. But others are more sort of in your face, where the coronavirus is literally, like we see on the right, literally depicted as being the Jewish people, implying that not only Jews are spreading this virus, but Jews are the virus themselves. Again, these sort of narratives and tropes, to the degree that they're finding voice on various social media platforms, and I don't mean just, Gab and 8chan and Reddit and, Steam and these gaming apps, but also on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, I think, again, serves to sort of normalize some of this hate that we're seeing, which actually has a huge role on how extremists will then play this out on the ground. Another common theme is greed, right? The scheming, manipulative sort of trope of Jews. And you see on the left here an example, again, of this caricature, one of the more popular memes online of the Happy Merchant, who's basically, trying to talk about how this vaccine will be created by the Jews in order to leverage this moment in time for financial gain. And on the right, a stereotypical Asian man basically coughing on Uncle Sam. And how does Uncle Sam respond? But again, hands the Jewish financer, a big check. So again, this makes use of age-old stereotypes for a current pandemic. Anti-Semitism, no matter what crisis happens, no matter what time, is always expected. What we're seeing here, too, is a massive amount. And it's hard to measure the volume of this because it's memes, it's commentary, it's text posts, a massive amount of anti-Asian and specifically anti-Chinese type of hate speech as well. And again, this goes across all different platforms. The notion that the coronavirus is taking different nicknames, like the Kung flu and Winnie the flu, the China virus, the Wuhan virus. And by the way, we are seeing these expressions of this hate well beyond just sort of the fringes of online platforms. We are seeing this as part of the public discussion, which serves to legitimize some of the hate that we're seeing on the fringes here. Again, this seeks to stigmatize and scapegoat an entire population of people. Again, these insulting and exaggerating the habits of Chinese, again, creates a broader sort of narrative online, a currency online, if you will, that isn't just being shared by sort of the extreme elements on, Telegram channels known to be used by extremists. But increasingly, these are spread sometimes through irony and humor, or that's the perception or the intent, as a way to sort of normalize these efforts as well. Now, I think, one of the ultimate concerns here is that when does this sort of humor and irony, which is, we don't think is funny, when does it actually end up leading to maybe incitement? And again, this is where you see some of these memes that are, are not a huge leap in terms of stigmatizing the entire, say, Chinese population. hi, I'm from China. Here somebody wants to saw off their arm, again saying you must have suspicion of any Chinese person that you come across. Or using, you know, other sort of images and memes, this one from the movie The Big Lebowski, which essentially says you need to go further if you come across a Chinese person. Again, normalizing sort of these concepts of violence against those who are being blamed for the spread. Now, some of the messages that we're seeing are sort of classic white supremacist narratives, if you will, that it's not about immigration and closing the borders and stopping the travel ban in order to sort of contain the virus, but that diversity itself, diversity that is behind immigration, is an actual public health crisis. I mean, that's white supremacy 101, where they talk about the left and liberalists and globalists, and basically diversity being a threat to the American way. And these are the types of language that we have seen play out well before the pandemic, just in sort of different circumstances. Here's a recent image, by the way. You'll see, if you can look on, you know, migrants accepted, now we're infected. Sort of these new sort of hashtags or tropes that are created that are circulating online. Now, right-wing conspiracy theories, again, take various different forms. And one of the things that we've been looking at, and, you know, with some concern, is how the anti-government extremist, say, militia movements would be responding. You know, this ideology of this movement is historically centered around conspiracy theories that claimed, you know, government was in league with a shadowy New World Order to strip Americans of their rights and to, you know, ultimately enslave them. And so for years, one of the ways that they imagined that this would play out is through government manufacturing a pandemic as an excuse to suspend the Constitution and enslave Americans. And, you know, now they have their actual pandemic. But what's interesting is that the Trump administration, the first administration that anti-government militia movement types have actually supported. And so their response during this crisis has not been to attack the federal government. You know, some of the state government and local officials have been more sort of the focus of their ire. But a lot of the conspiracies that are spreading still may be susceptible to those who may want to take it an extra level. So some are repackaging these old tropes for new storylines. Again, the government is going to impose martial law, round up dissidents into FEMA camps, confiscate your firearms. All of these still are out there as potential to spread and then create more of, animate many of these sort of anti-government militia types. So far, we have not seen that general level of anger. But again, the more that this spreads, the longer that this pandemic takes hold, the more government is asked to take steps to protect people in ways that some people may feel is overstepping, the more the anti-government right may try to find a way to leverage this moment. And then we have sort of the weaponization of this pandemic that we've seen some white supremacists and others try to engage with, where it's literally the type of thing where, you know, go find a minority and cough on them if you have the coronavirus. Literally weaponize this virus as a way to stop those who are our perceived enemies. And so again, this sort of meme culture of spreading this message, very popular amongst certain Telegram channels, amongst the accelerationists in the white supremacist world. Accelerationists essentially believe that we have to, you know, the time is ripe for society to basically implode. And once that occurs, a race war or a civil war can take place. And so for them, chaos, for them, you know, absence of rule of law, for them, a pandemic like this is exactly the type of atmosphere that's required for white supremacists to embark, and accelerationists in particularly, on the race war that they so deeply want. Now, I have to note that, again, all of this happens online. And I will say that more and more of us are spending our time online, especially those people who have children who are now home and, you know, being schooled remotely. More and more access, more and more time is spent on these online platforms, and that presents its own problem. That presents an opportunity for extremists to try to leverage the very social media spots that they're on. But we're also seeing how this is playing out on the ground. And here already, one of the ways that we track activity by white supremacist groups is the fact that they're putting flyers and posters on the ground. Very sort of old school way of delivering your message. But you'll see, here are some of the messages that they're delivering. Deport all illegals, close the border, stop immigration, stop the coronavirus. literally using images of a Corona beer and talking about how immigration kills. And then, you know, there was actually an example that I think really spoke to, I think, the potential danger here. I'm not so certain people, whether it's the Jewish community or other minority communities, are truly at risk of a Nazi sneezing on them on purpose in order to give them the coronavirus. Among all the concerns that people have today, that is probably a very small concern, although it's something that they're talking about and we need to be you know, aware of that. At the same time, we have seen an incident just last week where a 36-year-old was killed during a shootout with the FBI in Belton, Missouri. He allegedly showed up armed to pick up an inert explosive device that was supplied to him by authorities. He wanted to basically bomb a hospital that was taking care of people with the coronavirus. He wanted to do it with a car bomb. So he was the subject of an ongoing investigation, a federal investigation, and he was associated with the National Socialist Movement and the Warschaf Division, both of which are neo-Nazi organizations. And the image that you will see on the right is actually an image that we found of him being patched into the National Socialist Movement a couple of months ago, showing that he is, you know, literally became a member of this group. And when you look at some of the comments that he left on his Telegram channel that I have on the screen here, if you don't think this whole thing was engineered by Jews as a power grab, here's more proof of their plans. Jews have been playing the long game, and we are the only ones standing in their way. So here, I mentioned these conspiracy theories at the top of my presentation. And here's an individual who actually imbibed them, right? Believed them, and decided he needed to act on them. That's why what we're seeing online is so dangerous. And finally, you know, we have seen reports from around the country of Asian women and men being assaulted by people, whether they're extremists or not. You know, the fact that hate crimes are on the rise there. And so, you know, what we often talk about normalization of hate and extremism and how that buttresses extremist movements, the far right in particular in this country, when we hear it on our television channels and on cable news, etc. I mean, I would argue that what really normalizes this sort of invective is what we're seeing on these various online spaces. And when we have the data that shows that there's an uptick, again, fear and anxiety and uncertainty, this is the perfect time for extremists to try to find those who might actually subscribe to their ideas. Because in a time where there's so much uncertainty, we are looking to try to explain what is happening. And unless we push back on the narratives of these white supremacists, these far-right extremists, with such a captive audience, frankly, they will win the day. That's why it's really important. And the last point I'll make, we've actually seen, this is a Zoom call that GW has set up, white supremacists literally trying to infiltrate Zoom calls, Zoom bombing, by showing up, making, you know, racial epithets and showing their swastikas. And so again, this is a time where white supremacists are not going to stop doing what they do. The far right is not going to take a break for the coronavirus. And so we need to continue to monitor what they're doing, because for them, the time is right. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Oren. Excellent presentation, very useful slides as well. Of course, you know, perhaps unsurprising elements of anti-Semitism in the reactions. Also very important to note this kind of the influence, the online activity, and that sort of unique online culture and a constantly evolving online culture of the alt-right, extreme right, is influencing real world actions, particularly the Missouri situation you mentioned. And, you know, I think it's worth noting that I was actually reading recently that pandemics over history, and of course, you know, one of the great shapers of human history are pandemics, and we're living through that now. And xenophobia itself, as there are claims that I've read that it has itself a sort of product of experiences of pandemics over the centuries, millions and millions of people dying within months. That itself seems to have, you know, could well be the actual one of the sources of xenophobia in and of itself, which is very important to keep in mind. So a lot of questions coming up, which I'll run through here. First one here for Chelsea and Ayman. I think it's quite a good question, actually. How would ISIS interpret a potentially deadly outbreak of COVID-19 amongst its own top brass? if you want to go ahead, or whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I'll answer that one. Okay. No, I think they would stick to the line that it's actually that it is God's will. As I mentioned in my presentation, I think that's one consistent theme they have, is that whoever gets hit by this, and God willed it for one reason or another, whether it's to test the believers in their devotion to God and putting their reliance on Him, or whether it is actually a punishment against disbelievers or a test of disbelievers and how they react to the pandemic. So, in terms of their own reaction, no, they would stick to the. I think they would stick to the line that it's the will of God, and that the solution is to put their trust in God and reliance on Him, besides taking up precautions that could prevent the spread of the pandemic, like washing your hands and so on.
I mean, I'll jump in on that. I completely agree with what Ayman just said. And we also have to remember that ISIS as a culture has a huge culture of martyrdom. So if someone does get this virus and passes away due to it, I'm sure they'll just be glorified as a martyr of the greater jihadist cause.
Yeah, she's right about that. As they keep, one hadith they keep citing is from Aisha that the Prophet said that, you know, the one who gets afflicted in the plague and it's a martyrdom for the believers. So and the one who remains in the land of the epidemic, waiting for it and only expecting it will hit the one that God wills it to strike, then for that person is the likes of the reward of the martyr. So that's a consistent theme that's been running through their discourse as well.
Very interesting, thank you. And Ayman, question for you. Can you please tell us more about the other jihadist groups or ideologues' views or media productions about COVID-19, especially Al-Qaeda and AQ-linked groups?
Yes. So Chelsea had mentioned in her presentation the idea of coronavirus as this soldier of God. And so there was an article in the pro-Al-Qaeda Thabat news agency by an individual called Khalid Sibai. He explicitly talked about it in those terms, and as the soldier destroying the infidels. And like IS, although he was less specific, but similar to IS, he said that this was a time for the Mujahideen to launch their strikes and to bring down this system. And so other jihadists as well, including people I've interviewed, talked, for example, in terms of the collapse of the global system or a sign of the end times. I mentioned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a former Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. They talked about coronavirus. They had in their IBAN newsletter, the editorial line was they compared coronavirus to the gnats that God sent against the tyrant Nimrod. So again, they're focusing on the fact that the epidemic has primarily hit Europe and countries like Iran, and so that's part of the lens through which they interpret things.
Okay, thanks. And for Oren, is ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, tracking incidents of violence surrounding COVID-19 and anti-Semitism and anti-Asian views? If so, how fast are these incidents arising?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We are tracking both anti-Semitic incidents as we do year-round, but we've noticed an increase in the anti-Asian incidents, including hate crimes. And I'm just showing a screen share here of just some of the examples that are related, apparently, to this coronavirus. We'll be updating it again daily, but if you scroll down, I mean, this is significant, right? This is around the country. And the list keeps going and going and going. And so we need to understand that whether it's online sort of discussions, whether it's discussion in the public square, it does have an impact on the communities. And, especially in a time where there's so much uncertainty, the Chinese community, the Asian American community in particular, as you see, it just keeps going. So we are tracking that, and we're very disturbed by the level. And I would say in terms of the Jewish community, something that we have noticed again is, as more people are spending time online in Zoom meetings and in Zoom calls, extremists are sort of refocusing their tactics to try to, join unsecured Zoom calls. And so we're going to be providing recommendations that are pretty simple about how to make sure that when you have a Zoom call, you don't allow somebody to be able to Zoom bomb that. And that hopefully will help.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you. And yeah, the work of the ADL continues to be incredibly important, especially that tracking work. Very distressing to see it. Another one for you, Oren. As we see an increase in of National Guard or other security force personnel out on the streets, how much of a deterrent or motivator could this be to those militia groups who are more and more concerned with civil liberties being curtailed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's something I tried to address a little bit before, which is, you know, the conspiracies of the New World Order and of, you know, rights being taken away, whether it's gun rights, whether it's, you know, these conspiracies that, you know, there will be efforts to limit on a state level, let alone a federal level, one's rights to do anything, I think is something that is ripe for anti-government folks to embrace. And they're not going to do it as much, or they have not so far on a federal level, because they generally support the Trump administration. But as this goes on, and as more, whether it's National Guard or law enforcement or efforts to sort of keep people isolated continue, again, I think that's where the rubber will meet the road, and we will see how some of these anti-government folks will react. Hopefully, they will recognize that the conspiracies are not true, that this is a real, you know, public health threat. But again, the longer something like this goes on, the more people are going to be willing to embrace broader conspiracy theories.
Yeah, thank you. Chelsea, as far as the online jihadi ISIS movement goes beyond what you've already told us, someone was more interested to hear about, or rather interested to hear more about, how other kind of opportunities this offers for a sort of virtual recruitment for them.
That's a really good question, and I don't think I can actually give a solid answer because this is an ongoing issue. I haven't really seen any discussions on actual recruitment. It's been more based on glorifying COVID-19 and news reports here in the West of the amount of people that have contracted the virus and casualty rates. There's one user that's very active on Rocket Chat, which is another, in my opinion, slightly clunky social media messaging platform, but ISIS and its supporters have found a good home there. But there's one supporter that's very active with posting the amounts of individuals that have contracted the virus and have died in the Western regions of the world. But I haven't really seen anything as far as explicit recruitment. You could say that with the narratives of this idea that if you continue in the path of jihad, you will be, you know, a warrior of God and the virus will help you through that. In a sense, it incites the idea of staying on the course of jihad, but no one has specifically tried to recruit anyone for a specific action. Let's put it that way.
Thank you. Anyone else wanted to add anything to that? Okay. Ayman, very quickly, I'll get two more questions, one for Ayman, one for Oren. Two quick questions for you, Ayman, related to this prisons issue and ISIS. How do releases from prison in Syria affect jihadist activities? What has the response of supporters been to the alleged breakout of ISIS prisoners from the Hasaka prison this morning?
I imagine their supporters are jubilant about it, but in terms of what I've been trying to look for, which is IS's own official media, they haven't said anything about it yet. In terms of what they try to do for those who are released, well, depends who it is. If it's the males who are suspected IS operatives who are being held, then the aim of the prison breaks, of course, is to get them back out into the fields, as it were, to try to bolster their efforts. And you saw IS did similar things back in 2012 and 2013 in Iraq. But for women and children, whom of course IS would want free as well, it's a bit more of a difficult question what exactly they would do with them. Would they keep them along with them in out in the field or try to send them to a safe location, as it were. It's not exactly clear to me.
Okay, thanks, Ayman. And last question here from Amarnath Amarasingam, a good friend of ours, the program, of course, probably at least of some of you here. Thanks for watching, Amarnath. He's asking, it's a question for Oren. We saw in one of the documents that Ayman put out on COVID-19 is rightly forcing people to question their trust in government. So for Oren, is there a similar trend on the far right? Relatedly, I wonder if the participants could comment on some common trends in both jihadist and far right side. Not much from God rhetoric on the far right, for example, but what is common, if anything? Thanks. So go ahead, Oren, and then if you have anything else, any others wanted to add as well.
Well, we have seen examples of the sort of most fringe talking about, go cough on your congressperson's, your congressperson or in their office, or, go spread the virus to law enforcement in addition to minority communities. So, that's a level of like opposition to government. And so accelerationists and white supremacists essentially want the government and want there to be chaos. They want it to basically self-destruct. So it's inherently an anti-sort of government position. With those who are sort of known anti-government militias, etc., again, it's been interesting in that they haven't totally jumped on this moment, in part because of their support for the federal, the Trump administration and the federal government at this point. But I think it's very, very tenuous. And the more that these rules will happen, I think the more that we're going to see efforts to delegitimize our government and perhaps people taking the measures into their own hands. So that's where we're very concerned. In terms of the comparison between what we're seeing here, and with sort of Islamist groups abroad, I defer to my colleagues, Chelsea and Ayman.
Thanks, Oren. If you want to add anything, either Ayman or Chelsea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just say the common thread, is mainly with the idea of chaos and exploiting it, and a chance of bringing down the present order and the international system. I mean, some of the jihadists explicitly talk about the international system and Nizam al, the global system, and the collapse of capitalism, humanitarianism, and so on. So the idea of disrupting the status quo, that's the main disruption of it and trying to bring it down. That's the main common thread I see. Although, there are some very big differences as well, that you don't see the conspiracy theory that one human side made the virus in terms of the jihadist discourse. They don't talk about it as an American creation or Chinese creation or a Jewish creation. It's all about the will of God. And in contrast, you don't see that on the far right.
Go ahead, Chelsea, if you had anything to add.
I think Ayman said it perfectly. It really is more of the concept of it's a virus that's brought on by the will of God. So it doesn't specifically target governments. Although, we've seen a lot of anti-Shiite rhetoric among supporters, and they were very happy when Iran was reporting really high numbers of casualties and people with the virus. And so that just continue that whole anti-Shiite narrative and fell into common narratives we see in general with supporters from the Islamic State.
Okay, thanks. I guess probably what we'll probably see, I presume, will be both of them taking advantage. Both are very conspiracy-driven movements to one extent or another, and they'll probably still take advantage of this to develop other conspiracy theories, maybe not about where it came from, in terms of the shared approach, but the responses to it, vaccines being perhaps hidden or held back for certain groups, things like that. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw. I should also note, or sort of mention on that note, the program on extremism will be releasing a paper in the coming weeks on this issue of comparing jihadi and extreme right ideologies. I'll be one of the co-authors of that, so do keep an eye out for it. And with that, thanks again to all the panelists. And all of you who joined us via Zoom, a great number, fantastic questions. Thanks again for coming on. Please keep an eye out on our website, extremism.edu, and on our Twitter on the handle @GWUPOE. We'll be having more events like this. So thanks a lot, and hopefully see you again soon via Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you.
Take